Welcome to our continuing story on the other states of America. Native nations, breakaway republics, kingdoms, and colonial entities that existed within the modern-day boundaries of the United States. On theme, today we're not going to focus on New Jersey, but building on our last couple of episodes, we will learn about the colony of East New Jersey. Now for just a short overview on how New Jersey became split into two. The area that is now New Jersey, before it took on that moniker, was inhabited by the Lenape, and beside them to the south was the colony of New Sweden, and at the northern end was the colony of New Netherland. These subjects you can learn about in our first season of the podcast. New Netherland would come to take over New Sweden, and then in 1664, the English came and took over New Netherland. In English possession, the large swath of land from the Delaware River in the south to the vaguely defined uplands of what would today be modern-day New Hampshire and Maine all fell under a land grant given to the Duke of York, the king's brother, and thus became New York. Now obviously, if you know your geography, New York is going to get reduced in size. The southern bit of the New York colony was given to two prominent supporters of the royal family, the Lords Carteret and Berkeley. Carteret, being a former governor of the Isle of Jersey, was honored to have Jersey lend its name to this New Jersey. But a man of his standing, or of his partner Lord Berkeley, now owning this colony, were still too prominent to leave the old world for what to them would have been the edge of the known world. And as we see with many proprietors in these proprietary colonies owned by private individuals who are allowed to also govern the area, these well-to-do people would be disinclined to leave the power centers that placed them in a position to own an entire colony in the first place. And so they would often send over men that they would appoint to be governor. In this case, Berkeley and Carteret sent over Carteret's cousin, Phillip Carteret, a man who will always live in the shadows of his more accomplished relatives. And after the English takeover of New Netherland, Phillip Carteret came over to govern this New Jersey and immediately found more problems than he could have ever anticipated. The largest of which, and most surprising, is the antagonism that Phillip Carteret received and will receive from the governors of New York, who time and time again question the legitimacy of the New Jersey colony to even exist. Yes, the land was granted to the Lords Berkeley and Carteret, but the governor of New York, whoever that man is, and it changes a couple times, will always insist on newer and newer, more specific paperwork specifying that the Lords Carteret and Berkeley, in addition to owning the land, also have a right to govern that land separate from New York State. In other words, the governor of New York would always acknowledge, yes, you could sell land, just like anyone today could sell land and you could own land, but by whose permission do you have to set up your own government? Imagine you at home, listening right now, if your neighbor built a fence completely around his or her property, installed a flagpole, and ran up a flag with their face printed on it, declaring themselves their own kingdom. You don't see that very often. And the right to form a government is typically not included in real estate transactions. And so problem number one, Governor Phillip Carteret has to deal with a much larger neighbor keen on delegitimizing his rule and reabsorbing his cousin's colony. The second issue is that the early New Jersey colony is very underpopulated, especially compared to New York to the north. Many of the Lenape had removed a little further to the west. The northern chunk of New Jersey had a very small population of Dutch, of course, left over from New Netherland and not intending to leave anytime soon. And then the extreme southern end had a very small population of Finns and Swedes left over from the New Sweden colony. These people were generally peaceful, but had no real allegiance to the King of England, let alone to English lords. And then even before Philip arrives, the portion of the New Jersey colony that would become the East New Jersey colony receives a steady trickle of English settlers from New England and Long Island. Some were Quakers, others were Puritans. Specifically, the settlement of Newark was spearheaded by the diehards of the collapsing New Haven colony. And you can learn about New Haven in previous episodes of this season of the podcast. The problem for Philip is that these new English settlers had their land purchases from the natives confirmed by the governor of New York before Philip had even arrived. One of these areas would become known as the Monmouth Tract, sold mostly to Long Island Quakers. Those Quakers would found the town of Shrewsbury. Quakers not terribly fond of authority, by the way, keep that in mind. A division of the same tract became Middletown, founded by Baptists from Rhode Island. Rhode Islanders famously not a fan of authority. A portion of the area of Woodbridge was settled by a group from faraway Piscataway, Maine, fleeing the encroachment of the Massachusetts government up the Atlantic coast. And yes, this is the Other States of America history podcast. And so I don't want to focus on New Jersey for too much longer, but you have to know that Governor Phillip Carteret spends the next 7 or 8 years struggling to control this hodgepodge population that had little to no connection to the proprietary government of New Jersey. And in fact, the only relative peace the governor had came from a document called the Concessions. That's the abbreviated name anyway, which stipulated that settlers in New Jersey would have a 5-year grace period before they would have to start paying quit rents to the proprietary government. A quit rent being a precursor to property tax. And so for 5 years, Governor Carteret had to battle with the New York government and was mostly ignored by his own inhabitants. But that might be the extent of it, ignored because he wasn't demanding much from them. But after that 5-year period, and the governor came around looking to collect taxes, much of the New Jersey colony, especially the portion that would become East New Jersey, fell into rebellion. And at one point, they actually appoint a rival governor, none other than an illegitimate son of the Lord Carteret himself. Now we have 2 Carteret governments and the government of New York, all claiming to be the legitimate power of the area we now call New Jersey. This was the straw that broke the camel's back for Phillip Carteret. He returns to England to beg his cousin, to beg the Duke of York, and hopefully the Duke of York can beg his brother King Charles II to produce a document that would definitively say New Jersey is a separate colony from New York, and this is who can determine the composition of the government there. Now, there's very few personal papers from Phillip Carteret, and it's hard to get a view inside of his mind. But he receives the paperwork to legitimize his governance and sends it to the New World, but he himself remained in England, which on some level you can understand. Yes, of course he's delaying his return to this terrible job for as long as possible, but it would do him no good. The people of New Jersey, in receipt of this new paperwork, quickly remove the Lord Carteret's illegitimate son as their illegitimate governor, now clearly more a liability than an asset. And wouldn't you know it, when that man and his family were off the coast of the Virginia colony, they were picked up by a Dutch fleet that had recently pillaged its way through the Caribbean and was currently trolling the coast of Virginia, robbing the English of their seasonal tobacco crop. An unknown conversation ensues between the Dutch and the illegitimate Carteret. And before you know it, that Dutch fleet is sailing straight to Manhattan Island. Governor Lovelace of New York isn't in the colony. Governor Carteret of New Jersey, as we know, isn't in the colony. There were far more Dutch Marines landing on the streets of New York City than there were English soldiers in Fort James, and the Dutch ships in the harbor outmatched the cannons in the fort. In an almost bloodless victory, the exception being one Englishman who insisted on hoisting the English flag, who then got his head shaved right off his body by a cannonball, New York City fell to the Dutch and was renamed New Orange. Now the Dutch, emboldened by all this, intended to restore the New Netherland colony, which was shockingly easy to do. And in reference to our story, many of the towns in New Jersey, the west or the eastern portion, sent representatives to simply submit to the new Dutch authority on Manhattan Island. There was no struggle, there was no fight, and New Jersey was no more. And this will be the last time we see a unified New Jersey colony until the 18th century. Phillip Carteret back in England must have felt like a complete failure. And to add insult to injury, just as the war between the English and Dutch is wrapping up and the Treaty of Westminster is finalized, his cousin's partner, the Lord Berkeley, massively in debt and having received no compensation or income otherwise from his share in the New Jersey colony, decides to sell his half interest in New Jersey to a group of Quakers for 1,000 pounds sterling. Originally, the sale was just to a man named John Fenwick. You can hear our episode on his colony. But overall, this group of Quakers that would come to own half of a unified New Jersey wanted nothing to do with Phillip Carteret's government, or his lack thereof, and requested that his cousin, the Lord Carteret, divide New Jersey in half, so they may live and govern by their own design. And the paperwork would take until about 1676 to finalize. But yes, as a result of Phillip Carteret's bad leadership, the insolence of the settlers, the Dutch takeover, and Lord Berkeley's lack of returns on his colony, New Jersey was now split into two. And as the summer came to an end in the year 1674, and the Dutch were scheduled to hand back over what they called New Netherland to the English, Phillip Carteret gets on a boat to return to his cousin's colony as governor, or at least the eastern portion. Why he does this, I do not know. Why is he returning to this job he clearly doesn't like, he's not terribly good at, and he tries to avoid as often as he can? Perhaps family duty, perhaps pride, perhaps he did it for a chance at redeeming himself, or maybe there were no other opportunities afforded to him. And on that boat ride back to the New World, he may have even had a little spark of optimism within him. Except, on board that same ship would be the new governor of the New York colony, a man by the name of Edmund Andros. If you've listened to this podcast before, especially this season, you've heard his name before. There's no record of how the two men got along on the boat together, but Andros will take the same opinion as all the previous New York governors that New Jersey, as a whole, east or west, however you take it, is actually still part of New York. Andros has also been granted dominion over the various forts in the area, including those within the East New Jersey colony, and has been tasked with enforcing the collection of customs. Phillip Carteret has had a lot of enemies before, but Edmund Andros will be the worst one yet. In 1675, Governor Carteret, in the negotiated breakup of East and West Jersey, lost much of the Delaware River to West Jersey, and with it the settlers who were Finns and Swedes from the former New Sweden colony. The exact border between the east and west portions would change throughout the entire history of a split New Jersey. Carteret spent the year trying to meticulously and finally settle the disputed land claims from the various groups that were granted land by an earlier New York government and a later New Jersey government, and now his East New Jersey government. He would solve some of these problems, but they would persist long past his lifetime. He also sought to break up East New Jersey into counties, but as the year went on, all of the English colonies went into high alert. As King Philip's War broke out in New England, the English feared that it would become a general Native American uprising all along the coast, or at least down to the Delaware River. More than anyone, it would be Edmund Andros, governor of New York, who would make sure this would not happen. Nonetheless, all the men in East New Jersey, 16 to 60, were ordered to have a working gun, a usable sword, and a supply of powder and shot at the ready. All men within these age ranges were to participate in the local militia, and Quakers were not excluded. If they refused, they would be fined. And perhaps because of Andros's efforts and that of the Five Nations, who you might know as the Iroquois, the war never did trickle in the direction of New Jersey, east or west, both governments having very good relations with the Lenape. And this was a rare moment in Phillip Carteret's term as governor when he could do some rebuilding. We see that the East New Jersey Assembly is reconstituted, judges are appointed, and the hodgepodge that was East New Jersey begins to blend a little bit. People get to know one another. One example being the settlement of Newark, which originally intended to restart the Puritan experiment after the fall of the New Haven colony. From here on out, they become less and less Puritan and are surrounded by people of different religious persuasions. East New Jersey, of course, had liberty of conscience and no official church. And so these Puritans who moved from New England, they neither could claim to be persecuted here, nor could they really gain a firm grasp of the government as they could in places like Massachusetts, where suffrage was only extended to church members. Their church, to be specific. And here we see the workings of the phenomenon of the middle colonies, as any middle school student will know. In places like New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, You don't have strong majorities of any one specific religious group or ethnic group. And in the case of the Quakers, who would have a majority in places like Pennsylvania and West New Jersey for a long while, they're so laissez-faire and freedom-loving in many respects. The overall population of the middle colonies is just quite unique. And often you'll hear teachers explain the middle colonies as just a mixture of New England and the southern colonies, which might be true in terms of economics, but culturally they were just their own thing. You wouldn't say that colonial New Jersey was culturally halfway between Virginia and Massachusetts. In reality, the middle colonies just had identities of their own. This is especially clear in the division between the two Jerseys, where the English population, not speaking on other ethnic groups, but the English population that would largely fill in East New Jersey came from Long Island and New England. West New Jersey were a lot of these Quaker groups coming directly from England proper, with a smattering of Quakers from Scotland and Ireland. And based on the comments I received from our episode on West New Jersey, there's still a cultural divide between East and West Jersey. But this brief moment of peace, of happiness, of growth, of development is curtailed because in August of 1678, Edmund Andros, who had returned to England for a brief moment, returns knighted. Now, in previous episodes, I've called him Sir Edmund Andros, because that's who he becomes. But it is at this moment that he receives that honor. And returning to the New World with his knighthood, he is resolved to retake the New Jerseys. And no, Sir Edmund Andros is not a mustache-twirling villain who is evil for no reason. One of the big reasons he really wants to take out East New Jersey, the far more settled half of New Jersey, is that all ships coming from outside the East New Jersey colony were supposed to first report to Manhattan Island, to New York City, for customs inspection and collection of any duties on their goods. But the East New Jersey government, including Governor Carteret, refused to force the incoming traffic to then go up the coast to New York City. Instead, New Jersey operated free ports, like many of the ports in New England. Anything could come from any which way direction, without impediment or fee. Furthermore, once the goods are on the land, they could be smuggled into the New York colony. A colony of which the Duke of York was holding in order to receive some sort of profit. And one of his planned sources of revenue were going to be these fees collected from incoming ships. It frustrated the Duke that the income he was receiving, barely any at all, was not what he expected, and Andros, as his employee, was tasked with opening up these revenue streams. Now, what follows is a series of events that the sources muddle a little bit, whether or not they happen in 1679 or 1680. It really doesn't affect the story that much, but I lean towards believing that most of these events happen in 1680, because the standoff between the two colonies is broken by the death of Sir Carteret, Philip's cousin and employer. The owner of East New Jersey dies in January of 1680. Only with this event in place does it explain how Andros receives the hubris to do what he's going to do next. Because now we have East New Jersey with no living owner. You have Governor Phillip Carteret with no protection in the old country. You have Andros, who's now knighted, and he has orders to collect customs on ships in East New Jersey. All the pieces are in place now. But again, don't get too hung up on the exact date, because the feelings and emotions that these two men have for one another make the exact sequence of things irrelevant. Carteret informs Andros once again that they will not be collecting customs, nor will they allow New York officials to collect customs in East New Jersey waters or at the ports. In April of 79 or 80, Andros raises a force of men, only armed with swords, and they go to Elizabethtown. Carteret raises a force to meet them outside of the town, wherein Andros communicated that he came in peace. Carteret's men then let them into the town. Both men publicly read the documents of their colonies respectively and have a debate in front of the people themselves as to the powers each colony has, the legitimacy each colony has, and the roles each governor is supposed to follow and laws they're supposed to enforce. Andros then gives official warning to Carteret to stop exercising his perceived jurisdiction, and he orders the settlers of Elizabethtown to ignore Governor Carteret, and he sends word to West New Jersey that they should be ignoring the Bylands trustees running their government. Satisfied with what he had done, he took his force and retired back to New York. It's not recorded, but it's likely he gave Phillip Carteret the rest of the month to consider his submission to the New York colony, because on May 1st, Andros orders the arrest of Phillip Carteret for exercising authority over the king's subjects without merit. Now, all this legalese sounds like a lot of argument and paperwork, but think about this for a minute. What's going to happen right now is Andros is sending men into the East New Jersey colony to forcibly arrest their governor. Not so fortunate for Phillip Carteret, but fortunate for us, he wrote down an account of what happened. And he says that Governor Andros sent a party of soldiers to fetch me away, dead or alive, so that in the dead time of night broke open my doors, and most barbarously and inhumanely and violently hauled me out of my bed, that I have not words enough sufficiently to express the cruelty of it. And indeed, I am so disabled by the bruises and hurts that I have received that I fear I shall hardly be a perfect man again. I think it's perhaps every child's worst nightmare, the idea of a home invasion and being kidnapped. It's part of the reason why the Home Alone movies are so successful. They subvert those fears. And I don't know if you know this or not, but every adult used to be a child. Without any sort of warning at all, Phillip Carteret experienced a violent capture and captivity that completely stripped him of all the power he thought he had. One minute, he's the governor of East New Jersey, sleeping in his bed. And then he's being beaten in his own home and dragged to New York, against his will, without discussion. And now, with both Carterets out of the way, Andros and another force of men sail to New Jersey, where Andros installs himself as the new governor of East New Jersey. He calls the assembly, and he requires that they all give a new oath of allegiance. By June of 1680, the entire assembly is sworn in, and East New Jersey, perhaps not a subdivision of New York, became a satellite of the New York colony, sharing the same governor. Phillip Carteret, in a New York City court, was found not guilty on the charges that Andros brought upon him. Andros, of course, was furious, and before Phillip Carteret could be released, came up with a whole new set of charges and brought that before a new jury, who again found Phillip Carteret not guilty. Andros was forced to release Phillip Carteret, but he absolutely refused to surrender the governorship back over to him. And so poor Phillip Carteret took up residence in Elizabethtown, where he lived as a private citizen in his own cousin's colony, where his nemesis, using the death of his cousin, quite improperly seized power and now reigned as governor. Furthermore, Andros passed a law that if anyone was found speaking out against the Andros administration and for Carteret, they were to be arrested and taken to New York City for questioning. It would seem that in every conceivable way, Sir Edmund Andros has won the day. This episode should be over. East New Jersey is now a colony of a colony. However, in November of 1680, Andros receives a copy of the Duke of York's grant, having been reissued by his brother, Charles II, now including the many specific details as to how the Duke's lands were to be divided. And in it said that East and West New Jersey were in fact their own colonies with their own right to be governed separate from the New York colony. It makes no mention of poor John Fenwick's colony in and around modern-day Salem, New Jersey. That's an episode you can look for one or two back. And then, most importantly, it called for the recall of Sir Edmund Andros. He was being fired. Yes, people from Connecticut and from the Jerseys and from within New York itself had spent the last few years writing letters, complaints about Andros and his attempts to annex other English colonies, internal accusations of corruption, and at a certain point, it was just too much, and Andros was recalled. The boogeyman is gone. East Jersey was set free once again. And Phillip Carteret, a much defeated man, suddenly, once again, became governor of East New Jersey. Perhaps there was a moment of joy that rushed over him. But 1681 would prove to be a very difficult year for his governorship. It doesn't appear like much work was accomplished. And if we read between the lines, it looks like there was a great deal of gridlock and argument with the East New Jersey Assembly. For one thing, Governor Carteret's law code was not renewed during this year. And by November, Carteret dissolves the East New Jersey Assembly. The real nature of what was going on during this year, in the colony anyway, is somewhat obscured by the distance in time between us and them, of course. But with Lord Carteret dead, it's likely that Phillip Carteret was receiving correspondence from his widow that they were preparing East New Jersey for sale. That's right, the Carteret estate was going to auction off an entire colony. And to prepare for that, in late 1681, moving into 1682, Carteret starts a new de facto government without constitution or reliance from direction that could be found in a concessions document. East New Jersey, much like West New Jersey in our previous episode, was then placed in a trust controlled by 8 men back in England who were creditors of the late Sir Carteret. These men solely would be the government of East New Jersey until the sale could be made, and Governor Carteret would remain as a sort of figurehead, mouthpiece for the trustees back in merry old England. And again, the record is somewhat muddled, but it appears that Phillip Carteret finally was able to retire when the new governor arrived, but poor Philip would not outlive the year, and he dies during some time in late 1682. Only being about 42 or 43 years of age, he was not an old man for the time, certainly not a young man, and many authors have commented on his account of his own kidnapping 2 or 3 years previous to his death, his mention of no longer being a perfect man. If we read between the lines a little bit, it would appear that he had perhaps now a physical injury, maybe a limp, something that would be visible to others. Perhaps in this less enlightened time, it was seen as a source of weakness or a badge of his failures against Governor Andros. And then remember, he had to live under the illegal governorship of Andros in his own colony. Maybe his own self-expressed inability to become a perfect man again also had a psychological element to it, being kidnapped and beaten and all, and thoroughly defeated without the protection of your more accomplished cousin. Anyway, you look at it, Phillip Carteret, as young as he was in age, was a fossil who outlived his family's own ownership over the colony and died there among the inhabitants who refused to pay taxes, who at one time threw their support behind an illegitimate Carteret, who handed over the colony to the Dutch. I see no other way to color his life except as one of immense frustration and sadness. Perhaps a lot of it his own doing, but he was also handed a job that would prove to be very difficult for any man. But at least we could say this much of him. When he first arrived, after the fall of New Netherland in the 1660s, the unified New Jersey colony had a very small European population, perhaps a couple hundred on the Delaware, and the same number or even fewer on the portion of New Jersey that is closest to New York City. In 1682, when Phillip Carteret dies, the colony has a population of 3,500 people, between 7 towns and the surrounding countryside, and that's just the East New Jersey portion. And we can give Phillip Carteret a little credit here for striving to maintain New Jersey as separate from New York. Now, I'm not sure what year you're living in, but even to this day, there is a New York State and a New Jersey. Let's be charitable here and give a small fraction of the credit for that to poor Phillip Carteret. Can we do that? But anyway, we have to say goodbye to Phillip, and Carteret's widow sells East New Jersey at auction to a group of 12 men, 11 of which were Quakers. If you listen to our episode on West New Jersey, this should come as no surprise. Those 12 men each take on a partner, splitting their shares in 2, and what we end up with is 24 proprietors. These men have money, they have plans, they have the energies that were long diminished in the likes of Lord Carteret or Berkeley, and they are here to breathe a new vision and new life into East New Jersey. The new governor would come from their number, and it would be a man by the name of Robert Barclay. He's a Scottish Quaker, and Barclay decides that he will rule at a distance, and in his stead he will send a lieutenant or deputy governor. In West New Jersey, we saw a very similar situation. But under his influence, there would begin a small trickle in the years to come of Quakers into the colony and Scottish people into the colony. This would be no Quaker exodus as we saw with West New Jersey and Pennsylvania, no Puritan exodus as we saw in New England, but again a small trickle. In fact, the Quakers in the history of East New Jersey never really made what we would call a Quaker town. Nevertheless, they made up most of the owners of the proprietary shares of the colony. The one who was probably closest at hand and the most powerful would be William Penn. He would be one of the 24 owners. He previously was a trustee over and share owner of the West New Jersey colony and had most recently laid the groundworks for his own Pennsylvania colony. He would be traveling back and forth from the New World to England, although his energies very much split, concentrating most on his own colony, the Jerseys coming second or third in this case. And so the governor entrusts the on-the-ground government to two other Quakers, who arrived by the very end of 1682, a lieutenant governor named Thomas Rudyard, and a receiver general, tax collector. And with this new leadership in place, it became apparent that East New Jersey had grown enough that it deserved a proper capital. And moving through the 1683 year into 84, 85, 86, the settlement of Perth Amboy, then known as New Perth, was coming into being, a proper capital. Deputy Governor Rudyard also breaks East New Jersey into 4 counties: Bergen, Essex, Middlesex, and Monmouth counties. With these counties would come county court systems. The county justices were to levy a tax to build a jail for each county. Prisoners were to pay for their own confinement, and if that prisoner could not pay for their own confinement, the victim of the crime would have the option to pay for his confinement, and then when that criminal was released in order to pay off that debt, the imprisoned would become an indentured servant to his or her victim. Interesting system. Rudyard's government consisted of his personal council, which included the prominent landowners who lived in the colony, or in the case of William Penn, lived nearby, and that council served as a upper house, having legislative powers. The lower house, there was an assembly, which consisted of 14 what they called deputies, 2 from each of the 7 recognized towns. This would mirror the English system where you had the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Class distinctions very much at this time also meant political distinction. Under Rudyard's time in office, the law code that wasn't renewed several years before was reviewed, things were revised, and the 1683 law code was far less severe than the last, and historians like John Pomfret attribute this to the diminishing influence and fanaticism of the Puritan population of East New Jersey. Somewhat removed from their brethren in New England, were beginning to lose a bit of their zeal. In this code, there were far less scenarios wherein you might be sentenced to death, and likely because of the growing influence of the Quakers, who were quite critical of the institution of slavery, laws were put into place to guarantee that African slaves were given a prescribed amount of food and clothing that was deemed sufficient for the time. This is a nice handful of accomplishments for the colony, considering we're talking about a period all within the year 1683. And as great as this all is, Deputy Governor Rudyard becomes a topic of some controversy as accusations fly across the Atlantic about Rudyard reserving the best lands for himself and for his friends. And additionally, and most importantly to the Proprietors, as Rudyard is confirming land grants, he is supposed to preserve a prescribed fraction of the land for the Proprietors themselves, which he appeared to not be doing. The person receiving a lot of these complaints, and probably witnessing some of this firsthand, is of course William Penn, who back in England lets his business partners know that there are citizens in East New Jersey who are actively trying to get New York to once again annex the colony, that Rudyard is likely misappropriating the division of the land in his favor, and it seems likely that the real governor, back in England, Governor Barclay, proposed that Penn would take on the responsibility of deputy or lieutenant governor in East New Jersey, since he's in the area anyway. But William Penn was fighting this battle for East New Jersey while also helping the West New Jersey colony stay independent of New York, while also trying to build Pennsylvania, the center of most of his attention, which involved battling the governor of New York as well as the Lord Baltimore to the south over land disputes and the subject of governance. So it's likely at Penn's suggestion that the new deputy governor became a man by the name of Gawen Lawrie, who is a friend of William Penn and formerly one of the 3 trustees of West Jersey along with William Penn. Gawen was also one of the 24 proprietors of East New Jersey and also a Quaker. If William Penn is your varsity team, Gawen Lawrie is the JV team. He's the store brand, but he's willing to relocate to East New Jersey. And so Gawen becomes the on-the-ground lieutenant governor or deputy governor, however you want it. And Gawen Lawrie begins his term as the local governor, participating in the same sorts of hinky land deals that his predecessor was removed for. And thanks to the actions of Penn and Lawrie and the other proprietors, they shipped Gawen Lawrie over to the New World, along with a whole new round of paperwork from the Duke of York, to make it very clear to the governor of New York, no longer Edmund Andros, but still a problem, that yes, East New Jersey is its own thing, leave them alone. And what made Gawen Lawrie a slightly more powerful deputy governor than the ones we've seen before is that he was one of the proprietary owners. He owned one of those 24 shares, and he was the only proprietary owner who actually lived in the colony. Previously, the Lord George Carteret was the owner, and his cousin Phillip Carteret, if it were a business, we would call the manager. But now we have an owner-manager, and Lawrie was determined to gather together all the towns and all their competing claims, going back to Governor Nichols of New York, the different New Jersey governments combined and separate, their native purchases, and reconcile everything and reissue everything anew and in a less confusing state. This is the bean counting type of governance that, honestly, I don't think a lot of elected officials can really pull up their sleeves and do anymore. And he settles many of these overlapping issues, but not all of them. And moving into the year 1685, whatever progress Gawen Lawrie was making with the local assembly, events in England would take East New Jersey on a different course. Because King Charles II dies, and his brother, who will become known as King James II, comes to power. Now, King James II was the Duke of York, the proprietary owner of the New York colony. And with his ascension to the throne, prominent leaders in New York wrote a letter to now King James II, complaining that the separation of New Jersey from New York has diminished trade within his personal colony, and outlined once again the various ways the New Jersey colony was used to avoid customs. Now, if you know your English history at all, or the Magna Carta, if the monarch wants to levy a direct tax upon the people, he or she cannot do so. That is a power that had been delegated to Parliament. Americans might say no taxation without representation. But the king had other revenue sources. He could collect rents on land that he owns, buy and sell that land, but he also had certain rights over imports and exports. Things like tobacco and alcohol, it varies over time. But he could receive some revenue outside of the control of Parliament from licensing who could bring this stuff in and out, or collecting a customs on the importation of these items. Now that was important to King James II, because if you remember his father, Charles I, he was the king during the English Civil War, where the royalists faced off against the parliamentary forces. James was of the belief that having some income source independent of parliamentary control was essential to maintaining his power, but also keeping him funded and content, and therefore less likely to muck around with Parliament like his father did. New York was supposed to be one of these profit centers. It wasn't. And so in 1685, James II issues a quo warranto to inspect the East New Jersey Charter. A quo warranto, which I'm always going to mispronounce, is a demand to produce paperwork that details how someone, or in this case some corporation, justifies their power over a jurisdiction, or in this case colony. Not the end of the world, an inspection, not a revocation. Then moving into 1686, Lawrie managed to go 2 years before holding an assembly, which last met in 1684, and he unveils upon them something that had been 3 years in the making, a document called the Fundamental Constitutions for the province of East New Jersey. Constructed by the 24 proprietors, the East New Jersey Assembly rejected the Constitution and instead insisted on maintaining a much earlier agreement between settler and proprietor, the 1665 concessions and agreements, which applied to all of New Jersey. But there would be no unified response from the proprietors, because at the same time they were upset with Gawen Lawrie. And by September of 1686, they removed him from his position because of the same accusations of preserving the best land for himself and for his allies against the proper procedures put into place. Lawrie, on his way out of office, wrote the following, that he intended to go to England in order to clear me from these foul-mouthed, wicked slanders that proceeds from murderous spirits behind my back. So not an amicable split, but he probably felt some relief to finally be done with his job. He spent his entire term trying to extract quit rents, which the settlers simply ignored, arguing with the individual towns, and helping to craft a constitution which they rejected. Here's another reason we should reevaluate Phillip Carteret, who's often seen as a failure. Well, is he a failure, or was he given a job that no one could have done? The people on many levels seem unwilling to be governed. I wonder how that compares to people in East New Jersey today. Let me know. But it is around this time that Perth Amboy, as a planned settlement, officially becomes the new capital of East New Jersey. And much to the chagrin of traders in New York, many of the Lenape would travel there seasonally to fish the sea and trade furs. And Laurie's replacement would be a man by the name of Lord Neil Campbell, who sees to it that Lawrie is still made a member of the Governor's Council. Remember, he's one of the owners. And it is Campbell who, in earnest, begins the trickle of the Scottish to East New Jersey, particularly those of the Quaker faith. Small in number, but I wonder today how many descendants of these Jersey Scots can be found. The Lord Neil Campbell was probably avoiding some drama back at home involving his brother, who perhaps was fomenting a rebellion, and he brought with him his son and 50 prisoners as his own indentured servants. But very quickly he has a reversal, and in December of 1686, so within a year, he resigns as deputy governor in order to return to Scotland for his brother's trial. And he appoints a man by the name of Andrew Hamilton to be the new lieutenant governor, and makes Lawrie the deputy to the lieutenant governor. I know that's confusing. Now, who is Andrew Hamilton? Well, he was the man tasked with investigating Lawrie and his land deals over the last year and a half or so. He went from investigating the on-the-grounds governor to becoming that governor. His star was on the rise. Meanwhile, Gawen Lawrie, moving into the year 1687, the East New Jersey Proprietors took the opinion that Lawrie was unfit to continue him in any public employment, and he becomes a non-entity in our story. East New Jersey eats up another governor. Now, Hamilton was probably quite blindsided by Campbell's sudden resignation. New York likely took advantage of this and forced East New Jersey to accept one of their custom agents at the port of Perth Amboy, fearing that this was just the first step in once again trying to reabsorb East New Jersey. The proprietors in England sought guidance from King James II, but very quickly the wheels of history start to turn faster and faster. And it isn't New York that East New Jersey needs to worry about anymore, but something I introduced in our last episode, something I call the Blob. It will be a colonial entity known as the Dominion of New England, and its governor would be none other than Sir Edmund Andros, who has returned to the New World. And the Dominion of New England in the years 1687 into 88 will include Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Narragansett country set apart before Plymouth, Maine, New Hampshire, and then it's coming for New York that willingly submits, which brings the Dominion of New England to the very northern doorstep of West and East New Jersey. Andros is knocking once again. The freshly minted Deputy Governor Andrew Hamilton did not know what to do. So he gets on a boat to sail directly to England, inform the proprietors of what is happening, and create a plan. But he is captured by the French and imprisoned until the year 1690, which will be too late. I brought this up in our last episode also, and this is an idea that comes from the historian Maxine Lawrie, that like West New Jersey, East New Jersey went from being owned by a very few powerful people who would have a lot of say with the king and who could resist the Dominion of New England. Pennsylvania would be a great example of this. Under William Penn, Pennsylvania remained independent of the Dominion. But East New Jersey by 1688 went from having one owner, the Lord Carteret, who passed away in 1680, to having 12 at the auction, split into 24 by 1683, and by 1688, East New Jersey had 75 to 85 different individuals owning those proprietary shares. Only half that amount owning enough to sit on the proprietary board. Men of lesser influence with divided attentions. East New Jersey was not in secure hands. I turn now to the historian John Pomfret. By 1689, the right of government had become a liability. Land was the only asset of value. In other words, East New Jersey considering the cost to run a government and attention needed. And then concerning the people on the ground, Pomfret says, East Jersey was on the verge of rebellion during the whole period from 1672 until her absorption into the Dominion of New England in 1688. And that's exactly what happens. There was a fleeting attempt between the proprietors of East Jersey and West Jersey to unite with a unified New Jersey once more. That proposal was sent to the king, but it was all for naught. And on April 30th, 1688, the East New Jersey proprietors officially signed away their right to govern the colony. Yes, they could own land, but they couldn't create a government. And then the crown handed over East New Jersey to the Dominion of New England. And Edmund Andros had what he long sought. But not only did he have East New Jersey and West New Jersey, he had everything, up to the tippy top of Maine. Yes, I'm ending this episode with the bad guy winning. But that will segue perfectly into our episodes on the Dominion of New England. If you like this episode, please give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your audio podcasts. You can always subscribe on YouTube. These audio podcasts are being turned into something with a little more of a documentary flair, little dramatic music under it, heavily employing the Ken Burns effect on all the images. And remember, like I suggested last season, you could always just send me a brick of gold. I'm Eric Giannis. This has been the Other States of America History Podcast. Thank you for listening.